Federico Barocci was definitely one of the most highly regarded painters working in Italy towards the end of the 16th and in the very first years of the 17th century.
Nobody's ever heard of him, and yet he's one of the world's greatest colorists and one of the greatest draftsmen that there've ever been in the history of Italian painting.
He was a wonderful innovator, and he always has an original take on things. So they're really beautiful, and they're very intellectually interesting as well. Federico Barocci was born around 1533 in Urbino, a northeastern city not far from Venice. Urbino had been a major court center. Under the Montefeltro family, it really flourished and became a real center for erudition, for mathematics, for major artists came to that court. So by the time he was in his 20s, he had had exposure to a number of artists in the tradition of Raphael and the tradition of Titian. Federico Barocci certainly had an affection for the Duke Francesco Maria della Rovere.
The Duke was a very pious and intellectual man. He amassed a vast library in his later life and also wrote deeply.
He went to Rome in the 50s, and he went again in the 1560s. But according to his biographer, he was poisoned. There are various interpretations as to whether he was actually poisoned. I personally think he probably was. He retreated, and so from the mid-1560s till the end of his life, 1612, he lived and worked in Urbino.
Barocci and his family lived in the heart of Urbino. Visible from the top windows of his own house, Barocci could see the Palazzo Ducale. He often included that view in the background of his pictures.
When Barocci returned from Rome, he made his first real altarpiece, his Martyrdom of Saint Sebastian. The palette is dazzling. It is a dynamic altarpiece. It certainly involves you as you go in and you see the archers there and their dynamic poses. And to me, that's one of the great things that Barocci does. There is such inherent dynamism in so many of his figures that it really does point toward that explosive drama of the 17th century that we call Baroque.
He's a painter who's very, very interested in making things real. His concern is to make things more graceful without departing from real anatomy, the structure of the human body, and a plausible pictorial space. And he does this both by the flutter of drapery, the compositional lines, and he does it by color. When color, I think he's largely something which he invents, and he thinks of in, if you like, musical terms.
As we go on in his career, Barocci experiments more and more with the use of illumination. He does it in his stigmatization of St. Francis, where he hones in on the idea of the flooding of light, almost palpable light that washes over the figure of St. Francis, and you can almost feel it.
With his altarpieces, he really did want people to be transported out of themselves. He would have been very pleased by the idea of people actually forgetting themselves completely, as they did with certain types of divine music in front of his pictures. The idea of transport, you being enraptured, that is absolutely what Barocci is about.
The traditional way of assessing the importance of an artist such as Federico Barocci is influence, who looked at him, who was aware of him. Certainly, he was very important for artists working in the 17th century. We are now aware that once Barocci framed a subject a certain way, many followed suit. So he was very influential.
The Deposition in Perugia is a remarkable painting. It's sort of full of energy and life, with figures sweeping in from the sides, the Magdalene rushing in to support the swooning Virgin. Barocci enlivens even further the drama of the picture by his use of colour. His absolute obsession and fascination with colour, tone and light meant that drawing just with pen and ink, say, wasn't enough for him. He already wanted to explore the colour harmonies and relationships in his preparatory works. Very early in his career, he realised that using colours was a way of deepening his preparation for paintings.
What makes the Entombment a particularly compelling painting is seen in situ over the altar of the church. It's very clear that the body of Christ, central to the celebration of the Mass, is being taken to the slab at the lower left and by extension to the altar. So it really is this wonderful link between the space of the church and the experience of the devout worshiper who comes to the altar and the events that take place within the altarpiece. This is really a key example of a painting that once others had seen it, no one could quite think of the Entombment any other way, or at least not to have been impressed and influenced by Barocci's rethinking of this central issue in Christian imagery. Barocci's Visitation is one of his great works of art. At first glance, seems simple, but in fact reflects a great deal of thinking and reworking in the preparatory process. He explored who was going to be up, who was going to be down, whose hand was going to be extended. It was a complicated process to get the relationship between the two women perfect. Elizabeth is a lovely older woman, very sympathetic. Mary is a bit aloof, as she should be, and it's very carefully composed with these beautiful colors, this archway, this glimpse into the city behind them. It's really a stunning achievement. Barocci painted The Last Supper over roughly 9 years. It's really one of the culminating masterpieces of his career. It's a large painting, and Barocci beautifully captures the individual personality and relationships of these 12 apostles. The Last Supper also introduces, as Barocci always does, a new take on the Last Supper. The opening of the sky, this angelic host comes down. It really is a marvelous effect of light and dark. In many cases, people have not been aware of how complex the thinking that Barocci brought to these pictures. They are so charming that one needn't necessarily worry about that. One can appreciate them as these very beautiful paintings, but they do reward that greater reflection on the meanings of these stories. Certainly there is an utter devotion that comes across in Barocci's altarpieces.
He was a very devout man himself. For him, there was no separation between his art and devotion.
When one looks at either the theological debates of the time or the biblical accounts of these stories, one is impressed with how closely he adheres to these very complicated, sometimes sophisticated ideas. But he couches them in the everyday, even though his specific figures are highly idealized. He sort of gets the way people behave. Barocci's Madonna del Gatto presents a very young, youthful Virgin Mary. She's rather smiling, rather vulnerable. She's in the act of nursing her young baby. There is something so serenely domestic about it.
The one thing he really excelled at was making the sacred look really agreeable and pleasant and convincing as something that was above our world, was sacred, was more beautiful, more heavenly than anything we could understand.
One of the features that makes the Madonna del Gatto particularly enchanting is the reference to the architecture of the ducal palace, and that's the little window seat or bench with its slightly flaring leg.
Barocci included objects from the real world in these very mystical pictures as a way of bringing them down to earth, introducing things with which people were very familiar, like earthenware pots, and of course he caught every nuance of the glaze across its surface. He often included little tableaux vivants in the foreground, even of quite a dramatic scene like the entombment. There'd be a rock with the pliers and the nails, all done with this wonderful sense of naturalism and tactility, always the tactile, so that you almost feel you could go and pick them up yourself. He often introduced animals into pictures as a kind of light aside from the deep impact of the gospel. I think this sort of love of animals and children as well was all very much part of Barocci's very kind of humane nature. He loved to animate his pictures with these things that he himself had glimpsed in everyday life. Barocci is one of the world's great draftsmen. He drew obsessively. Valori, his biographer, tells us that he was always around town with sketchbook in hand, and if he saw a face or an expression even on a face that particularly inspired him, he'd immediately get out his notebook and start sketching. And then if he was really interested, he'd invite his model back home to pose so that he could go into even more detail. There was a great kindliness in the way that he looked at the world. Even when he had a model in front of him, he would ask the model to assume a pose that was, first of all, served his purpose, the narrative, but then he would check with the model whether the pose was comfortable so that it could be more natural. Always he was in search of the natural. It's extraordinary, for example, how many drawings there are of hands, feet, heads, even fingers. Barocci would experiment endlessly with the poses. He would start from one pose, flip it around, then zoom in to a detail, then further in. Nothing was left to chance. We learn so much about his pictures from his drawings. By looking at them, we can reconstruct step by step exactly all his thought processes and technical processes of how he put together a composition. He was, it has to be said, a great perfectionist. He spent most of his time on the preparatory process. And then apparently he painted very, very quickly, using his fingers all the time, smudging here and there, and bringing everything into this wonderful tonality and harmony, composing his tunes.